All right, we are, this is Book of Revelation. We're nearly to the end. Chapter 20, so could be a couple more months. And we've been in chapter 20, the first couple of verses, for several weeks now, and I think we'll probably be camped out there this week and next week also, and then we'll move into the really difficult verses of verse 4 and 5. But let's start out by reading the passage, Revelation 20, 1 through 6. So who's got that?
I've got it.
Becky, go ahead, Becky. Becky's got it.
And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient spirit who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. I saw thrones on which were seated those who had been given authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years.
Amen. Thank you. So the passage that we just read, as I've said before, it's one of the most discussed passages. It is central to dispensational understanding of end times. It is a secondary passage in most of the other systems. And, you can read it as we just did, and you can probably see why there's some difficulty. I mean, it is symbolic language, using a lot of figures and metaphors and pictures. And it has to be interpreted just like we interpret everything else in the Bible. You interpret it against similar things that you see in the Bible elsewhere, maybe things that might be clearer. So we've been working kind of through this passage chronologically or sequentially, I guess. Sequentially, we've been working through it verse by verse, and there's I've been talking about the kingdom of Christ and how that kingdom is prophesied to be worldwide in extent. So it's prophesied to grow and grow, and how that kingdom will lead to, or that extent of the gospel will lead to worldwide conversion, and that the kingdom of Satan then will be crushed while the kingdom of the Messiah expands. And the reason I wanted to talk about those things at this point was because we were talking, the millennial reign of Christ is associated with the kingdom prophecies. All of the kingdom prophecies in the Bible are associated with this. And so just a quick overview again, just to catch up everybody. The various viewpoints are these on the millennium as to its nature and its timing. So in the futurist position, the millennium is 1,000 years long, and it is in our future, and it occurs after Christ returns to earth, and then he sets up his millennial kingdom. In the dispensational view, that kingdom is the kingdom that was promised to the Jews in the Old Testament, and which Jesus offered to them in his ministry. And when they rejected and killed him, that kingdom was postponed. And on the dispensational view, that kingdom is not in existence now. Christ is a king, but he's not reigning over anything. We read the quotes last week about that. That's the dispensational position. And that this whole working of Christ with the church is just kind of a separate program, a separate plan, that God is going to work with the church. And then when Christ returns, there's the rapture. Well, we have two events, but the rapture takes the church off the earth so God can turn to start to deal with Israel. And then after the tribulation, Christ returns, sets up his millennial kingdom, and reigns from Jerusalem. And that millennial kingdom in the dispensational view, which is future for us, is Old Testament in nature, Jewish in nature. Sacrifices are reinstituted. There's a priestly order. All of that. It's so that's one view. Another futurist view is a historic premillennial view, and it's similar in that Christ returns to earth. There is no rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation. Christ returns to earth, and as he is descending, the saints are raptured off the earth to be with him, and then they all return to earth together. Christ sets up his millennial kingdom and reigns from Jerusalem for 1,000 years, but there is no sacrifices. It's not Jewish in nature. It's and that's because in the historic premillennial view, there is no separation between the Old Testament people of God, who we call Israel, and the New Testament people of God, who we call the church. There's no separation. On the dispensational view, they're separate people. And then the non-futurist views, basically have amillennialism. That view says that the millennium is the period of time from the first coming of Christ in his ministry, when he bound the strong man and started gathering the plunder, basically saving people out of the nations and out of the world, and that the millennium began then and will continue until his second coming, until his second advent. And so obviously the nature of the millennium is very different in an amillennial viewpoint than it would be, say, in a dispensational viewpoint. In a dispensational viewpoint, you have Christ physically reigning, from Jerusalem. You could get in your car and drive over there and possibly even see him. In the non-futurist viewpoint, Christ reigns from heaven over the earth, continually during this period. We don't see him. He's not sitting on a throne on earth somewhere. So my understanding of the Bible, for various reasons, is that Christ is presently enthroned and is reigning over the world, and he's seated on the throne of David right now in the heavenlies, and that he is currently subduing all of his enemies under his feet, and that when he has done that, he will return, and then the last enemy will be destroyed, and that last enemy is death. And death is destroyed at the general resurrection when Christ returns. And that summary I just gave you relies heavily on some passages that we looked at recently, 1 Corinthians 15, Hebrews 10, that says Christ is waiting in heaven until all of his enemies are put under his feet. And also it relies on the understanding that when Jesus told the parable of binding the strong man, that he was talking about binding Satan. And it's pretty clear in the parable that the strong man is Satan. And so then when the similar language shows up again in Revelation 20, people who eventually arrive at a non-dispensational or non-futurist view read Revelation 20 and go, well, this is just Matthew 12. It's just the binding of the strong man. So that's kind of where we are, kind of a wrap up of what we've got to so far. And I want to just make it, the invitation to you, Mike B, since you are joining this group new. You can ask any question you want. You can stop us at any point and say, wait, I don't get it. What are you talking about? In fact, anybody could say that if you don't get it. So
in fact, I do that often.
Yes. My mom often forgets just what we said, and she just jumps right back in. So you're totally welcome to and encouraged, to interrupt. We obviously don't have a time that we need to be finished by. So we're not on it. So with that, before I launch into go forward, do you have any questions? Does anybody have any questions or comments? So at this point, usually Shirley says something.
So my comment is that was a really good review of the various views. And I'm going to make sure that I go back and watch this, at least first part of this lesson again. Because
Good.
it's all stuff that is relatively new to me. And I feel like I really want to absorb it and understand it and keep it.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Thank you for that. That's encouraging.
Well, it helps you in knowing them too, so that if you're with somebody that is of a different view, one of those different views, and they have questions, it might help you to better answer their questions, or at least show them where they could go for the answers or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure does help with conversations with people. One of the things I noticed when I started teaching the book of Revelation about 15 or 20 years ago was that the first group that I taught it to, about 26, 27 people at the Methodist Church. That was a long time ago now, Don. It was like 20 something, it was 15, 20 years ago.
Eons ago.
Yeah, it was my impression that I didn't take a survey, but it was my impression that everybody in the group thought there was only one view. And so it was a big surprise to them that there are historically all these other views of how to interpret the Revelation. And that was a surprise to them that there were people that actually held these other views that still live, that are alive today. But through that teaching, I think a lot of people came to change their basic view. And not that that was my intent or goal, but that just happened through their course of study. But it's very interesting that when you talk to people, usually we only think we think everybody has the same view we do. That's just our general default position. It's good to know that there are different views. So we're looking at the growth of the kingdom leading to worldwide conversion. And that is on page 2 of the outline that at the top says Revelation 20 through 22. Alicia, can you hear us yet? No. Lord, please help Alicia to get on in Jesus' name. So let's look at the growth of the kingdom to lead to worldwide conversion. Let's go to Psalm 66:4. We'll start there. We looked at Psalm 22 last week. Psalm 66:4. So this is one of those places where we have a different translation, where the different translations give a different meaning, basic different meaning. So I'll read the English Standard Version, and it says, "All the earth worships you and sings praises to you. They sing praises to your name." So the very first phrase, "all the earth worships you," that's a present tense statement. And that's different than, say, the King James or the New King James or some of the other translations. So, Shirley, do you have Psalm 66:4?
Yeah, mine says, all the earth shall worship you, and shall sing unto you, and they shall sing unto your name. And this speaks of the coming kingdom age, which will be a time of universal praise and universal worship.
Yeah, so
Future.
it's future tense, right? So all the earth shall worship you, they shall sing praises. And so we have, this, when I put this outline together, way back when, for that class I mentioned, I was using the Revised Standard Version, and it follows the King James there and says, all the earth will, it updates to will instead of shall, all the earth will worship you. And so I understood this passage, as Shirley does, to be a forward-looking prophecy. It's a statement of the psalmist that the God that he worships will be worshipped universally one day. And I still understand it that way, but even if I'm wrong about that, there's lots of passages that do say that God will be universally worshipped. So wanted to go here and just show you that sometimes looking at different translations is gets you, makes you want to study it more so you can see what's going on. But let's go to Isaiah 2. This is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Jerusalem and Judah. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of Jacob, temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths." The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. So, very famous prophecy. Isaiah here is getting the Lord is giving him a word about future days from him. That's what "in the last days" mean. In the last days is not does not necessarily mean in the days right before the end of history. In fact, it probably didn't mean that, and doesn't mean that. Didn't mean that to Isaiah's audience, and doesn't mean that now. In the last days means in the future, and if it has a more precise or technical in Isaiah's future. If it has a more precise or technical meaning, it means in the days of the Messiah. Mom.
How do you know that?
By comparing what last days means in other passages. Does anybody have an ESV study Bible? Oh, no, nobody's got an ESV study Bible.
I do on my phone.
Oh, on your phone? No, you won't be able to find it.
I have an NIV study Bible here, but
Yeah.
the ESV was next on my list.
Let's see if I can find it. Oh, well, I can show one. I can show one example of yeah. So I can show an example. So let's look at Joel 2. I think we looked at this recently somewhere. One of the studies.
So Mike B, this is an example of how I ask questions that take us kind of down the side trail.
A good question, though.
Let's see. Looking for the place that's cool. There it is, verse 28. All right. Joel 2:28. You'll recognize this. So I have the NIV in front of me. It starts with the words "and afterward." Does anybody have anything different than that? And afterward.
And it shall come to pass afterward.
Okay. Does anybody have "and after these things"? Or okay. Well, there are other translations that the only three that I've heard of are the one that you just said, Mom, and the simple one "and afterward," and then "and after these things." Obviously, it just means future. Doesn't mean
Well, mine says that, and it shall come to pass afterwards.
right. It shall come to pass afterwards. So it's another. It's just after this. So, and what's going to happen? I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance, as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls. So you recognize the passage. It's quoted in Acts 2, right? It's quoted on the day of Pentecost at Acts 2. Now let's go look at the way Peter quotes it. So I think that's around verse 17, Acts 2, 17, I think, maybe 16. Oh, yeah. 17.
Yeah.
Sorry for that. What's happening is they're speaking in other tongues because the Spirit has fallen upon them, gives them words to say, gives them utterance. And what they're doing is they're praising God and telling the glories of the gospel in the languages of all these people who have come into Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. And there are people from all over the area, and they speak different dialects, different languages, and the Spirit has given them languages. Supernaturally now they are speaking these languages, and they're actually evangelizing as they're praising God in these other languages. And the people say, what's going on? What does this mean? And there's the accusation that they're drunk. And so verse 14, then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd, fellow Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem. Let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And then he quotes, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. So he updates the phrase is synonymous. I'd say it like that. The phrase is synonymous with after these things, or it shall come to pass afterwards, or it, just the generic later on this will happen is used synonymously here with in the last days. And when Peter says in the last days, I think he has a more precise meaning than just afterwards. He's saying in the days of the Messiah. That's what he means. He's not making a prophecy for, the end of time. Because what he's explaining, if you look at verse 16, he says, the people are saying, well, you're all speaking in tongues and we can hear the praises of God in our own languages. What is this? What is this that's happening? Right? What does this mean? And Peter says, well, this, verse 16, this thing that you're seeing and hearing and experiencing, the pouring out of the Spirit, the speaking in other tongues, this is what Joel said would happen. So he's not talking about last days like a future thing from him. He's saying, I'm in the last days right now. And it's significant that he quotes everything that we just read in Joel. He even quotes the stuff about the verse 19, I'll show wonders in the heavens above, signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. He quotes the entire passage and he says that's being fulfilled right then. And so this also then as a side note helps us understand something about how to maybe interpret the astral phenomenal language, the decreation language, the language about fire and blood and smoke and the earth, because those things weren't apparent to your natural eyes. You would not have seen that. You would not have been able, they weren't standing in the dark. The moon did not turn to blood or even red. There were no signs except for the Spirit speaking through them. So this is just when God does a new thing, this type of language is used. So we were looking at. So Alicia's been able to join us. She can hear me, right? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Cool. So we were reading from Acts chapter 2 in response to a question that my mom had. The question was, I had said that the phrase last days doesn't necessarily mean end of the world. And in fact, in a lot of places, it just means in the future, kind of a generic, after this thing happens, another thing will happen. And to show that, at least one instance of that, I went to Joel 2 and showed that Joel says afterwards, or it'll come to pass afterwards. And then then it's pouring out the Spirit and the sun and the moon turning to fire and blood and, that kind of thing. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And then Peter quotes this passage, but he changes the language from afterwards to in the last days. And Peter's using it precisely to mean in the days of the Messiah. But because Peter's he's explaining a phenomenon that's happening right then and not talking about something in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah. Was that sufficient, do you think?
Yes.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Chuck,
Shirley.
did you notice, I just noticed something in all my years of Bible study and stuff, in the book of Acts, 17, it speaks in pairs. And what I mean by that is, okay, it says, I pour my spirit upon all flesh, spirit and flesh, your sons and your daughters, young men and old men, and visions and dreams.
Mhm.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is. And I think that a lot of the prophetic words in the Old Testament that God speaks this way in pairs or triplets or contrasts, opposites sometimes, so that it's a literary feature that helps people remember it. And yeah, Mom.
I have one more question. I'm
Yeah.
looking at the Acts passage, so it's the same, it's the quote from Joel. So
Right.
I'm looking at verse 20. Sun shall be turned to darkness, the moon to blood before the day of the Lord comes. Is this a poetic allusion to the whole order of things is going to be shaken up like we've talked about before?
I think it is. Yeah. That's, and again, so, it probably doesn't need to be said anymore at this point, but there's always another different way that someone might interpret it. And I'm not talking just about some one person, there are different schools of interpretation, right? So a dispensationalist, for instance, would look at this entire passage and would say that verse 17 was happening then, and also verse 18. But verse 19 and 20, Peter skips ahead. There's this prophetic perspective where Peter looks across time and skips ahead to the end of time and says, before the day of the Lord, because in the dispensational view, the day of the Lord is that final day of the Lord's coming and maybe the judgment, or some dispensationalists say it would be the entire coming of Christ, millennial period, and judgment. But in any case, it's in the future. So whatever paradigm, whatever worldview, whatever interpretive schema that you're convinced is biblical is the one that you tend to see, right, when you read the passages. So that's what they do. But so the assumption of someone like me is that Peter's not doing that. He's not jumping to the future. And if he meant to say, because his subject specifically in verse 16 is what's happening now, right? And if verses 19 and 20 don't apply to what's happening now, then the Holy Spirit could have left them out of the quotation. Or there could have been a little more clarity about what's going on. There's no indication that he changes the time.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So, all right. Good question. Where am I now? Let's see. I had oh, there it is. I had all the Bible verses open. Okay, so we're back in Isaiah 2. That's what we had just read prior to the Joel section. So Isaiah 2, a very famous passage again, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be exalted. It says, in the last days. I think this is a person being used to speak of the period of the Messiah. And in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's. Oh, so on the outline, where are we on page 2?
Mm-hmm.
Section 2B, the growth of the kingdom to lead to worldwide conversion. And the outline is the Revelation 20 to 22. See, Alicia's flipping through pages. She's got it. All right. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the streams, and all nations will stream to it. Then the rest of the passage talks about, going up there to learn of the Lord and to walk in his ways, and then going out from there and taking that word into the nations where they had come from, right? It's all the nations. So here's the picture. All the nations stream to Mount Zion. Okay, so the mountain of the Lord. So this is not a literal picture. I can guarantee that. You can tell by just the language, it's not to be understood literally, because the language is this, that the mountain of the Lord will be exalted as the highest, right? Highest of mountains. So you have the temple of the Lord at the top of this mountain that is now the highest mountain. And you've got all the nations streaming to it. That means that the stream must go uphill. And so this is a figurative expression for the exaltation of the kingdom of God, and the nations coming to the waters of life, to use another biblical image, and getting from Mount Zion, from God's people, the teaching of life, and then they take it. So verse 3, many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. So they come to Mount Zion, and the Lord teaches them. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between nations, settle disputes, so they'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up sword against nation, and they will not train for war anymore. So the picture here is, in the last days, the temple of the Lord will be not only established, but it will be exalted above all other, say, temples, so all other proposed ways of salvation. The nations will come in to the temple, and so we have a picture very similar actually to what Acts is, the book of Acts, right? Especially at Pentecost. Pentecost is described in language that is an echo of this, where all the nations come in and hear the word of the Lord, and then they all go back home and evangelize. And that's what this picture is, of a worldwide thing like that. The point on the outline is that the growth of the kingdom, which we looked at last week, leads to worldwide conversion. And that worldwide conversion then has effect in the world order. We can see that we have not yet obviously reached that place in the kingdom, because people are not beating their swords into plowshares. Individual people are doing that in their hearts, but we have a war going on. So yeah, go ahead, Mom.
Oh, a tiny little pause here for a moment of worship.
Always good to pause.
Verse 5, after this description, O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Comes the invitation. I love that.
Yeah.
This is what's going to happen. Come, be part of it.
Be part of it. And see, and you can see how the Prince of Peace, how his peace extends over the world. If the nations come in, just imagine it. The nations come into the church, they hear the word of the Lord, they put down their weapons of war, and they spread the gospel of peace. And so Isaiah then, like you said, Mom, calls to the house of Jacob, to the Israelites, people in the kingdom of Judah, let's do this, get on board with this. Lay down your weapons and come to the Lord.
Well,
Go ahead, Gail.
what I think is interesting is my version says, come descendants of Jacob. So instead of talk house descendants, but I think it's a slight distinction, because it's relating to people instead of a structure where people reside.
Okay, so right, instead of relating to a nation, a generic nation, you mean? It's
Right.
It's a call to an individual, to the individuals of that nation.
The descendants of,
Yeah, I can see that. So
Well, I always heard that the house of Jacob meant that he was speaking of his family. And so I don't know.
no, you're right.
That's
It's
what I
all
heard.
of that's correct. That the house of Jacob, or the descendants of Jacob, or in verse 3, it's the God of Jacob that people are going to learn from. That he is, the call in verse 5 is to the individuals of the who have identified themselves or been identified with God. And
Yeah, he's basically inviting them to walk in the light of Jesus, you know, because they are God's children and they shouldn't be walking in darkness, right?
that's right. That's right. So this is one of the great prophecies that is very easy to remember because of the picture. Now, in the since I've mentioned dispensationalism a couple of times, I'll just mention here that this is taken very literally in dispensationalism. The part, not only just the part about the nations coming in, which is great, and I think you should take that literally, but the part about the mountain being made the highest mountain. There's standard teaching in dispensationalism is there's going to be topographical changes to the land of Israel, where Mount Zion becomes the highest mountain in the world. And it's because of the commitment to literalism is where that comes from. It doesn't matter to me if the Mount Zion becomes the highest mountain in the world. It has absolutely no relevance to what the passage means. But and I think probably it's not a big deal to them whether it actually becomes, but they're committed to a way of reading the passage that leads to that. So
I guess my literal interpretation of Mount Sinai, it already is the highest mountain in the world because that's where the Lord was. So
Yeah.
I look at it from that standpoint, not a physical structure, but
right.
that's where the highest of high was,
Mhm.
what met.
Yeah. It is the mountain from which God reigns.
Exactly.
And God is reigning from that right now, and it's not a mountain in Palestine or Israel. It's the heavenly kingdom. So, yeah. So
Well,
let's look at, yeah,
I'd hope too that the Mount of Zion also speaks of the church, and
right.
you know, just like the Hebrews are physical Israel, us Christians are really the spiritual Israel when you think about it.
Yes.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And Mount Zion is a picture of, or is a, maybe picture is too weak of a word, but Mount Zion and the church are equated, or I'd say it this way: Mount Zion and the people of God, who in the New Testament are called the church, spiritual Israel. And so if an Israelite, a actual biological Israelite, comes to Christ, he's part of spiritual Israel. And so he is, all of God's people worship God in Mount Zion or on Mount Zion, which is the place where God has put his name, which in the New Testament is the church. So yeah, let's look at Isaiah 66, 18 and 19. So we've looked at sort of how Isaiah starts. Look at close to the end here. Isaiah 6, 18 and 19.
You say 66?
Oh, 66, right, 66, sorry.
Okay.
Isaiah 66, 18 and 19. Thanks, Shirley. So I think I said the wrong
Sure.
thing. All right, Mike B, do you have that?
Yes. 16, sorry, 18 and 19, right? Okay.
Right.
And I, because of what they have planned and done, am about to come and gather the people of all nations and languages, and they will come and see my glory. I will set a sign among them, and I will send some of those who survive to the nations, to Tarshish, to the Libyans and Lydians, famous as archers, to Tubal in Greece, and to the distant islands that have not heard of my fame or seen my glory. They will proclaim my glory among the nations.
All right, so this is very near the end of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is known as the fifth evangelist. They look at his book and it's so full of the gospel, and Puritans gave it that name, fifth evangelist. This passage talks about God gathering the people from all nations and languages, and they'll come and see his glory. So the people are moving toward where the Lord is. He's gathering them and they're coming to see his glory. And this is the same thing that we've seen in Isaiah 2, where the nations come and see the Lord's glory and they learn of him and then they go out. Verse 19 is the same thing. I will set a sign among them and I will send some of those who survive to the nations. Then the nations are listed. These are nations that existed in Isaiah's day, and some of them existed in the first century, and maybe one or two of these still exist today. But this is about, it's about God. I mean, this is an amazing thing. This is about God sending the gospel to the Gentiles, sending the good news about who God is to the nations, to the Gentiles. These are all Gentile nations. And how does that happen? Well, something happens among God's people, the Jews. This sign happens among God's people, the Jews. And the nations come to see. And as they come to see, then they're taught, they're converted, and they go back out and they evangelize and proclaim God's glory in the nations. So again, we have it's the same kind of pattern that we see in the book of Acts. We see this kind of thing. So the worldwide conversion, the plan for the worldwide conversion of the nations is the gospel. We all know that. And it's a work of God drawing people to himself and then creating messengers to go out to the nations and bringing the word out. So we've seen this phenomenon happening, in this period of time from the cross until now, where God is sending messengers to the various nations and people groups, and we're seeing conversion. And so, people look at stuff and they go, well, is the Ukraine a fulfillment of prophecy, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I can look at missions and say that's a fulfillment of prophecy. That's what this passage is about. And you can see prophecy being fulfilled right now. Mom.
So in verse 19,
Mhm.
is the sign the resurrection?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I don't have a definite opinion on that. It's a sign set among them, and it could be the resurrection. It could be the people of God. That are set among them. It could be, if this is a direct Pentecost, application, then it could be the descent of the Spirit on his people at that time. Yes, Mom. You're on mute. You're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
She can't. Can you come off mute? Were you going to say something?
There you go. I was trying to get my cursor from the big screen to the little screen so I could unmute myself.
There.
So I think this is also very, it's a wonderful section because he's talking to the Jews.
Mhm.
And verse 20, and they shall bring all your brothers from all the nations as an offering to the Lord. This is a clear statement of the fact that this is going to go out to the Gentiles.
Mhm. And
Because there weren't Jews living in all the nations.
yeah, not in Greece, right? Yeah, not in some of these, not at the time that Isaiah wrote this.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's definitely talking about Gentiles receiving the knowledge of the one true God, and then Gentiles evangelizing Jews, right?
Yeah.
It's the when the fullness of the Gentiles come in, then all Israel will be saved. It's kind of that pattern, right? But what the verse 20 also shows, and they, that is these Gentiles who've been evangelized, will bring all your people from all the nations to my holy mountain in Jerusalem as an offering to the Lord. This shows the essential continuity between the people of God in the Old Testament and the people of God in the New Testament. God isn't saying, oh, and the Gentiles are going to come to me here and you're going to go to me there. But he's saying, no, we're all my people will worship me the same. right? And they're going to come and bring you back out of where you've been lost in these nations, right? And they're going to be converted back, converted to the worship of the one true God, truly. So, looks like I might have
Hallelujah.
lost. Yeah. Yes, definitely. So there we go. We did the whole book of Isaiah, beginning and end. That's the bookend.
2 to 66.
That's right. 2 to 66.
That was quick.
Now you know everything important about the book of Isaiah. Right. So I think we just got a few more minutes. Let's look at maybe John 12. We're going to look at this theme is the kingdom of Satan. I have John 12 in the wrong spot on the outline. It should be underneath the next heading, under heading 3. The kingdom of Satan will be crushed while the kingdom of Messiah expands. John 12, 31 and 32. Who's got that?
Says, now is the time for this world to be judged. Now the ruler of this world will be expelled. As for me, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw everyone to myself.
Mhm.
Amen. So we see the kingdom,
Resurrection.
when he's lifted up,
Mhm.
right, when he's exalted. Well, there are 2 different ways that people understand the lifting up of Christ. And this has nothing to do with, if you're dispensational or not. It's just 2 different ways basically are that the lifting up, one is on the cross, right? When I'm lifted up, I'll draw him into me. And so he'd be lifted up on the cross, like literally physically lifted up. And then the second one is exalted, the exaltation. So when Christ ascends to heaven and is seated at the right hand of God, then what he's going to do from there is draw all people to himself, which is, again, this is language from the Isaiah passages, right? He's drawing all people to himself.
Mhm.
And the thing that I want to point out here in relation to Revelation 20, Revelation 20 shows a judgment of the devil, right? Where his activity is curtailed. He's not completely inactive, but he's bound in relation to deceiving the nations. And this is the language that comes out of Isaiah and other passages, the nations. And here, Jesus in his ministry, in his first century ministry, he says, now is the time for the judgment on this world. Now the prince of the world will be driven out. It's completely obvious that Satan has not been inactive since the first century. But he was driven out. And his power is crippled and his areas of influences are restricted. And so Jesus is here talking about his what is the driving out? What is the judgment in relation to in the passage? It's in relation to the drawing of all the people to himself. He says, I'm driving them out. And the consequence of that is that I'm going to draw all people to myself. Well, the consequence of binding Satan so that he can't deceive the nations is that the nations aren't deceived, right? That they can't be deceived anymore, that the gospel can go out with effect to the nations. So I think we're talking about the same thing, or at least the pattern's the same, but I think we're talking about the same thing. So when we read in Revelation 20 of the binding of Satan, it's not necessary at all to think that that means he's completely inactive, because he's driven out. He's no longer the prince of this world, but he's not inactive. He just doesn't have the authority to keep people in the dark anymore. So the church, this is why I like Matthew 16:18, right? Jesus says, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So if you've thought about that picture, so in the ancient world, when there was a war, so one army is advancing and everybody, so they're advancing against the city, and the people in the city go inside the gates and shut the gates, and they're inside there. And so the city itself is immobile, right? It's not advancing. It's not advancing. It's retreating. It's defensive. The
Hunker
gates of
down.
hell, yeah, the gates of hell will not prevail. The picture is the church advancing, not Satan's kingdom. Satan's kingdom is back in the stronghold. Close the gates. And
We think
Christ
of
says,
Satan
well,
in this case,
Yeah.
at this period of time. It's kind of like, Satan is kind of like a dog on a leash.
yeah, kind of like that. And so the picture of the church that Jesus has when he says the gates of hell will not prevail against the church is that church is the advancing army. And we see great darkness in parts of the world right now, great spiritual darkness. And, you know, the church is in retreat in some places. And this is definitely not the picture that that we get from Matthew 16:18 and these other passages. These are things we need to be in prayer about, because a lot of people have been taught and think that what's going to happen is that Satan's going to so oppress the church that we're going to be battered down and in retreat, and then Jesus will come and deliver us. But the picture that Jesus has is that the church overruns the gates of hell. So it's a completely different picture, completely different mindset. And he's driven out the prince of this world. He's bound him so he can't stop the advance of the gospel. This should give us great confidence that the things that Christ said will actually occur. Go ahead, Gail.
So there's that, I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't quote it exactly and I don't remember where it's at. But what about this, the statement of broad is the road to destruction and narrow is the path to salvation?
Yeah.
Way few to find it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Matthew.
So, yeah, let me look at that passage. I think it says few who find it, right? That's the part you're thinking about, right? 2 ways. Okay, so Shirley, do you have the passage?
No, I think it's in Matthew somewhere, but I can't remember where.
Let's see.
I know what she's talking about,
okay.
though. Broad is,
Yeah, it's
broad is road. You
Matthew
got it?
7. Yeah, Matthew 7, 13 and 14. All right, so we'll look at this. Enter
Yeah,
through the
yeah.
narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So, yes, this passage is, I assume that you're asking Gail about the few find the way to life. Whereas I've been talking about extensive conversions and looking at passages about worldwide. So everybody sees the apparent conflict. We know there's not an actual conflict because it's the word of God and won't contradict itself. But we see a problematic thing here. I guess we'll say that.
Isn't it talking about two different groups of people, though?
Yeah, I
One
think
is
that's
talking about the church and the other is talking about everyone else.
Yeah.
well,
Or everyone, including the church, I should say.
Yeah, I would say it like this. So there's 2 ways. Again, here's the 2 ways you can interpret it, and then you have to take one of the ways. I don't think there's a third option in this case. And you have to fit it in with all the other passages that you have thought through. So one of the ways to take this is that this is Jesus talking about all of time. In all of time, then that this is the way it's going to be. The people are going to go to hell. You know, it's going to be large numbers of people, just a wide road, highway of people going to hell, highway to hell, right? ACDC. But the way to heaven is just this narrow, wicket gate, you know, and that only a couple of people are going to be going through that. And so at the end of all of history, on the final judgment, it's going to be like 90% of the people go to hell and 10% go to heaven, or something like that. Some really imbalanced. So that's the first view. Jesus is talking about all time and making a pronouncement about the final day and the accounting of numbers of people, quantity. The second way that people have understood this is that Jesus is not talking about all time, but he's talking about that time. And he's talking to his Jewish hearers. And he's saying to them, work hard to get into the kingdom of God, because it's going to be tough, and only a few people at a time are going to be coming in from this Jewish first century audience. And so, there's really no way, actually, by looking at it, I don't think there's any way by looking at the setting of this, the context or the wording, to say which of those interpretations is meant. It obviously it means the first century, but does it also mean all of time? And then, so the people who, so again, this is what we've run against this a lot of times, where you have passage A or group of passage, group A of passages says or appears to say one thing, and then passage B or group B appear to say something that might conflict with that. And what we all have to do is make one of them priority and the other one subsumed underneath it and explained to be in harmony. That's what we all do, and nothing wrong with that. And it's actually necessary, because God's word is consistent. So then what it comes down to then is the proper procedure. And what is the procedure? The procedure is to take, not just count noses, but to take the clear passages and use them to help you understand the passages that may be less clear. This passage is pretty clear, but part about it that is not clear is this a universal statement, or is it specific for one period of time? And that's the key question. So then this would move this passage into a less clear passage. Go ahead, Gail.
So my default is, whether it was then or now, doesn't matter. Just follow the Lord.
Yeah, just follow the Lord. Right. And that's always
Yeah.
the best response, right? I don't understand it, but I'll just follow the Lord, because I know that I can do that. So I guess I would say it like this. I think the passages, well, it seems to me, and many, 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 many others, that the passages like what we read in Isaiah and other places that we've read in previous weeks about the worldwide extent of the kingdom, Isaiah 9, his peace and kingdom will expand forever, that kind of thing. That those are talking about all of the time of the Messianic age. They're talking about the last days, the period of the Messiah's rule. So they're basically, they have this giant outlook, right? They're looking at a giant amount of time, and it's a general statement. And I think that they're pretty evident that that's what's happening, that they're not talking about one specific instance or something like that, but a general characterization of the entire period of the Messiah's rule. And or you got passages that talk about at the end of that rule, every knee will bow, every tongue confess Jesus Christ is Lord, that kind of things. And then we take those passages that to me, that's the clear set. I see those and I go, well, those are clear. That looked like it's a kingdom defining passage. It says this is what this kingdom is about. And then I take a lesser clear passage, like I would say for me, this passage here in Matthew 7 is a lesser clear passage just because of the time element. And I would say, well, then this one lesser clear passage does not overthrow or make me change what I think about all of the passages which I think are clearer. So therefore it must be interpreted in a way which harmonizes with these other passages. And for me, that would be to say, I think this is about the first century audience. But if you ask me, can I prove it from that text? No, I can't. So is that whole outline of what I do with it, is that helpful? You don't have to do the same thing, but well, you are doing the same thing, but you might have a different set of passages. But good question, Gail. Good question. And I'll think about it some more. I think about it every time this question comes up, which always comes up when I go through these passages. And it has to do, I think, again, ultimately, at the end of the day, we all have an outlook. And you could say,
Mhm.
we have, this is an unfair characterization, but you could say our outlook is positive, as far as the prospects of the church and the gospel in the world, or negative, right? And one of those is right, but we all have a disposition. And if I think our disposition is negative, meaning that the growth of the church and the kingdom will be minimal, then this passage here fits right into it. And it becomes a key passage that helps us define, our belief. And if our belief is, I'm saying positive, I'm not trying to prejudice anybody by using those, you know what I mean. But the kingdom's going to grow in all of that, then this passage becomes secondary in our understanding, not primary. So, all right. Any other thoughts about that? I know I just see it's a little after 10:30, so I've overtalked my time again.
Well, I asked the question at the last moment.
You did. Last moment questions have to be addressed. All right. Well, so we'll continue to work through this. I think we're in page 2, section 3 now. Look at that. We got out of one section and moved into the next. This is why we have no idea when this Revelation class will end. All right.
Soon.
Soon.
Yeah.
The end is soon. It's near. It's right at hand. The judge is at the door. Yeah. All right. I'm going to stop the recording.